Jewish leaders are taking matters into their own hands to fight back against anti-Semitic hate preachers after months of inaction from authorities. No one has been charged or reprimanded or anything, not for shouting "Gas the Jews" on the steps of the Opera House or any of the Muslim clerics who've threatened jihad or called for Muslim armies to fight the West. Nothing has happened. Now the Executive Council of Australian Jewry is looking at legal action against these people, including under the Racial Discrimination Act. Well, joining me now is Co-Chief Executive of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, Peter Wertheim. Peter, just talk us through exactly what kind of action you are planning to take. You have things like 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act available to you. In lieu of the law being used criminally, what can you do?
Well, thanks for having me on, Caleb. There are several legal avenues available to us under both federal and state law, which would enable us to seek redress for the kind of hate speech that has been directed against our community. At this stage, we are still awaiting legal advice about the most appropriate avenue to pursue. One live possibility, as you have correctly pointed out, is a complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission under the Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act. But we're not closing off any other options either.
What is the effect of all of this? I mean, obviously, if someone had been charged, and obviously the New South Wales Police looked into a number of these clerics who had given sermons talking about, trees talking and saying there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him, all this kind of thing. They opted not to press any charges because they didn't believe they had enough there to do it. I think that was the wrong decision. They should have gone ahead anyway and let the court sort that out. But without the threat of, say, jail time, what would you actually be hoping to achieve?
Well, the kind of remedies that are available under civil law and private civil actions are things like a declaration that the law has been breached, an injunction that would restrain the person concerned from repeating the conduct, and a breach of that order would then amount to a contempt of court, which could then be the subject of criminal proceedings for contempt. So it's quite a serious matter to breach a court order. So really, those are the only really two important things that we could seek. If the matter is successfully mediated, which is a possibility, but perhaps a remote one in this case, then other possibilities emerge. There can be public apologies and that sort of thing. But overall, there's a limit to what the court could do in circumstances like this. And they are, as I said, a declaration and an injunction against a repetition of the conduct.
Surely it can't be cheap to run cases like this.
You're absolutely right, Caleb. It does take vast quantities of resources, not just financial resources, but time, effort, and human input into these cases if they're fought to the bitter end, as we would assume a case of this nature would be. And there's also the possibility of other kinds of action, challenging the validity of the legislation and so on. So there can be appeals, there can be all sorts of things that can happen during the course of a proceeding. And all of it is extremely time-consuming, extremely costly. And even if we are successful and an order for costs is made in our favour, there's no guarantee that the person concerned would be able to pay those costs, which would be very considerable, and we would then have to commence bankruptcy proceedings, yet another round of legal proceedings to put that into effect.
Which is the last place you'd want to end up in. I mean, your organisation reported recently that there's been 738% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Australia between October and November last year compared to 2022, which is extraordinary. I mean, how has it been so difficult for governments and police forces to do anything about this. So you end up in the position of, having to spend significant amount of money to do something yourself.
Well, I would answer it this way, Caleb. I would say that the level of propaganda that we've been hearing, the hate propaganda in the context of the current Israel-Hamas war, and the way it's involved the brazen inversion of the truth and the hysterically emotional way it is being conveyed in public is something quite new in Australia. It's very much the way that political discourse is conducted in the Middle East outside of Israel, but completely alien to Australia's political culture. So I guess in a way it's understandable that governments and law enforcement agencies have struggled to adapt. But the end result is that we're left to our own resources and to fight this battle ourselves. I have to say, since we announced that we were going to take this course of action, we've been inundated by messages of support from not just the Jewish community, but the wider Australian community, which is very heartening. But somebody has to make a stand against the hate preachers at some point. You can't just let this thing go on endlessly, because it only invites worse forms of behaviour in the long run. And the longer you leave it, the worse the behaviour comes and the higher the price that has to be paid to deal with it. So it's best to deal with it now.
Indeed. Peter Wertheim, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.